Today we're talking about Cuba, a small island that became the crossroads of a global struggle between two superpowers and nearly pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. Imagine a country located just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. A country where American cars from the 1950s still drive through the streets, where time seems to have stopped, and where the political system has barely changed for decades. Today, Cuba is often described as a country frozen in time. But it wasn't always like this. Cuba was once one of the richest countries in Latin America and one of America's favorite vacation destinations. So what happened? How did Cuba transform from a prosperous island into one of the most isolated countries in the world? This is the story of Cuba. Cuba before Castro. During the first half of the 20th century, Cuba was heavily influenced by the United States. American companies invested in sugar production, banking, railroads, and infrastructure. Havana quickly became one of the wealthiest and most vibrant cities in the Caribbean. By the late 1950s, Cuba was among the richest countries in Latin America. Its income levels surpassed many neighboring nations, and Havana was often called the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. Hundreds of thousands of American tourists visited the island every year. However, behind this image of prosperity lay serious problems. Much of the country's wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. Corruption was widespread. In 1952, General Fulgencio Batista seized power in a military coup and canceled elections. Over the following years, his regime received support from the United States, but dissatisfaction inside Cuba continued to grow. Corruption, poverty, and political repression fueled public anger. That anger would eventually pave the way for revolution. The Cuban Revolution. In 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro organized an attack on the Moncada barracks. The attempt failed. Castro was arrested and imprisoned. After his release, he left Cuba and moved to Mexico. There he met Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. In December 1956, Castro returned to Cuba aboard a small yacht called Granma with 81 supporters. Within days, most of the rebels were killed or captured. Only a few dozen survived. They escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains and launched a guerrilla war. Over the next 2 years, the movement gained support across the country. On January 1st, 1959, Batista's regime collapsed. The dictator fled the country. The revolution had succeeded. Many Cubans welcomed the victory with great hope. They expected democratic reforms and a more just society, but Cuba was heading toward a very different future. Conflict with the United States and the Cuban Missile Crisis. After taking power, Fidel Castro launched sweeping reforms. Banks, businesses, and large private properties were nationalized, including assets owned by American companies. Thousands of business owners and middle-class Cubans left the country. Many settled in Miami, which would later become the largest center of the Cuban diaspora in the world. Relations between Cuba and the United States quickly deteriorated. In 1960, Washington began restricting trade with Cuba, and in 1962, President John F. Kennedy imposed a near-total trade embargo. Many of those restrictions remain in place to this day. In response, Cuba moved closer to the Soviet Union. However, the Cuban Missile Crisis did not happen in isolation. Before Soviet missiles appeared in Cuba, the United States had already deployed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey, close to Soviet territory. Moscow viewed these deployments as a serious threat. The Soviet leadership decided to respond by placing its own nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. In the fall of 1962, American intelligence discovered Soviet missile sites under construction on the island. The world suddenly found itself closer to nuclear war than ever before. For 13 tense days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of catastrophe. In the end, the crisis was resolved through diplomacy. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. As part of a secret agreement, the United States later withdrew its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Although the crisis ended peacefully, Cuba became firmly aligned with the Soviet Union. For the next several decades, Moscow provided Cuba with billions of dollars in economic assistance, supplied oil at favorable prices, and purchased Cuban sugar above market value. This support helped sustain the Cuban economy for many years. The collapse of the Soviet Union. Everything changed in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. Almost overnight, Cuba lost its most important ally and source of financial support. The country entered a period known as the Special Period. The economy suffered a devastating shock. According to some estimates, Cuba's GDP fell by roughly 35% within just a few years. Fuel became scarce. Rolling blackouts became common. Food was rationed. Many Cubans were forced to use bicycles because gasoline was difficult to obtain. Numerous experts believed the Cuban government would not survive the crisis, but it did. Instead of abandoning the political system, Cuba introduced limited economic reforms. Small private businesses were allowed. Tourism became one of the country's most important sources of income. Cuba today. In 2008, Fidel Castro officially stepped down from power. Leadership passed to his brother, Raul Castro. Some economic reforms followed, but the political system remained largely unchanged. In 2014, a historic breakthrough occurred. U.S. President Barack Obama and Raul Castro announced the normalization of relations between the two countries. In 2015, Cuba and the United States reopened embassies in Havana and Washington for the first time in more than 50 years. Travel restrictions were eased, and Americans found it easier to visit the island. For a moment, it seemed that decades of confrontation were coming to an end. However, many of these changes were later partially reversed. Today, Cuba continues to face serious challenges. Economic growth remains weak, wages remain low. The country frequently struggles with shortages of goods and resources. Around 11 million people live on the island, yet hundreds of thousands of Cubans have left the country in recent years. In 2022 and 2023 alone, the United States recorded a record number of Cuban migrants. Many young Cubans continue to seek opportunities abroad. For more than 60 years, Cuba has followed a path unlike almost any other country. Supporters argue that the island preserved its independence despite pressure from a far more powerful neighbor. Critics argue that decades of centralized control have held the country back economically. Regardless of perspective, Cuba's story is far from over. And one question remains: will Cuba embrace major change in the future, or will it remain a country frozen in time? Share your opinion in the comments below. History is full of stories that shape the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And stay tuned, another story is coming soon.